Hello everybody, Ian here. So today I'm going to do an update on the Pentagon leak story. Most of what I said in previous videos did turn out to be true. However, I'm still seeing a lot of skepticism about the validity of the leaks. I'm seeing accusations that this was deliberate military disinformation. I'm seeing a lot of other speculation that is simply wrong or a misunderstanding of how military intelligence and information management in the US works. So I'm going to talk about all of those issues in today's video. And there's also a link to the text in the video description below. So essentially, since I last made a story about this a few days ago, there has been an arrest. A Jack Teixeira, an Air National Guardsman in Massachusetts, who was arrested and charged with the crime of supposedly uploading classified slides and documents to his Discord group. Now, essentially, this matches up exactly with what I said previously, that I believed that the person responsible for this leak was likely a conservative and also likely to be a gun owner, just based off of the background noise in his photos. He had some gun brands or things I interpreted to probably be related to guns, and that did turn out to be true. However, people still doubt the story, so I'm going to address some of those issues one at a time. So the first question I see repeated very often is that people don't believe that a low-ranking airman in the National Guard could have access to these slides. Well, that's simply not true. To begin with, these aren't the nuclear launch codes. These aren't slides about the Osama bin Laden raid before it happened. These aren't urgent, super secret information that has to be kept to only a few people. This is just very mundane daily briefings that generals receive. There's a lot of people involved in making these presentations, so it just requires a lot of people to know about it. I also point out the person responsible for the WikiLeaks dump, Chelsea Manning, who is also a low-ranking person, a PFC. So again, people who say they don't believe that a low-ranking person could have access to top-secret information, well, it's happened before, and no one disputes that Manning was the person responsible for this, so that's not a reason to doubt this. Ultimately, accessing classified information in the Department of Defense boils down to two factors. One, you have to have the appropriate clearance, so in this case, a person would have had to have a secret, or in some cases a top secret clearance to access these files. And he also would have had what's called a need to know. So just because I have a top secret clearance doesn't mean I can go access someone else's files. I have to have a legitimate reason to need to see those files. And I have to gain approval. So apparently this guy, if he is indeed the person responsible, had both of those things. He was an IT specialist, which actually means he would have far more access than even a high-ranking person who was involved in these briefings. He could conceivably have access to everything on the network. And again, this isn't unusual. Go into any military IT shop or J6 shop, and you'll see PFCs and corporals and other lower-ranking people. Just because someone's low-ranking doesn't mean he's not important. It isn't doing important work and needs access. Think of it like an airplane mechanic on an aircraft carrier. I mean, are you going to say just because a low-ranking person can't have access to the world's most sophisticated technology? Of course he can. Just depends what his job is. In this case, it's completely believable that an IT specialist would have access to these documents. Now, some people were confused on why an Air National Guardsman would have access to things that the active duty military is doing. And again, like with the previous points, this is just misunderstanding how American Reserve components work. So in this case, he is an Air National Guardsman. However, he was working on a military base as a full-time person. And this is very common. Every reserve component and the National Guard have full-time people. They have full-time military people who show up to work in their uniforms, and they also have civilian employees too. It's actually possible for a person to be a reservist who shows up to work once a month as a reservist in uniform, and the rest of the time he works maybe at the same place as a civilian employee. In this case, it looks like he was a full-time airman. Now, I have seen some people who doubt the validity of the leak say this is deliberate, that's actual deliberate disinformation put out by the Pentagon. Well, maybe. I said this even in my first article and video about this, that this could conceivably be deliberate disinformation from an insider. I don't think that's the case, though, because there's simply no benefits. There's no positive outcome from this story that would justify the embarrassment and the bad press surrounding the leak. Making yourself look incompetent isn't worth whatever they could gain from this. Also, typically, disinformation is targeted at the enemy. You don't compromise your own morale and security, which this did. Even if all the information on the slides was false, it's not a good look for the Pentagon or the Biden administration or anybody. I don't really believe someone could propose this as a serious idea and it would get approved. Also, we have to bear in mind, if you're going to make an accusation, this is military disinformation, I ask you, okay, well, who is responsible for it? There are several agencies. It could conceivably be the DoD itself. It could be the CIA. Well, the problem with this theory is that it involves throwing your own person under the bus, and that's just, it's something I would expect from a movie. I just don't believe it's possible to really put together a plan like this and for it to work. It's too silly for me to believe. Also think of real life examples like McCarthy's Red Scare. He went after Department of State employees and accused them of being closet communists, and that worked until he went after the army and they crucified him for it. It was just a tribalism thing. He got away with beating up state employees, accusing them of being communists, but that game ran out for him when he started accusing military people of being communists. The army just wouldn't put up with that and took him apart on national TV. One interesting theory I've actually seen floated by one of my Russian friends is the possibility that this leak was done by a larger conspiracy of mid-level officers in the DoD who are unhappy about our involvement in the war and are trying to end it by causing the Pentagon and the Biden administration embarrassment with these leaks. Now, that is possible. I won't sit here and deny that. There really isn't a way to prove or disprove that theory. However, I tend to not believe it because it just seems overly complicated and risky. So if I was, say, a major or a colonel in the Pentagon or elsewhere who was unhappy about the war and wanted to cause embarrassment with a damaging leak, I wouldn't go about it this way. This was actually one of my very first points when I first laid eyes on these photos. They're just very sloppy and careless. There's just too many ways this could backfire and be traced back to the person who did it, which is exactly what happened. And there's just not a need to have a fall guy. I mean, why have someone arrested at all? There's just too many risks. Even if there's one person who is held responsible and blamed for everything, there's just still too much residual risk that the other conspirators or the true conspirators of this leak are caught. If I was going to leak this, I would go about it differently. I wouldn't use Discord. I would go on a Russian website like VK or Zen or possibly Telegram, because the US government has no way to look at those websites and trace user data. It would be much safer, and it would eventually get back into the public eye anyway. That's how I would go about it. And that's also why I don't believe this was a larger conspiracy with other people. It was probably just one guy. The cover story is most likely the true one. Now, another very common reason people doubt this story is because they look at some of the information on these slides, like casualty counts, ammunition counts, and they say, oh, well, this really isn't anything we didn't already know. Well, that's true. But again, I think there's this very common misconception. And again, this misconception isn't accidental. The military portrays themselves as all powerful, and even people who don't like the American military tend to believe that story. In reality, our intelligence gathering capabilities are wildly exaggerated. So if you're disappointed in the information on these slides, well, I ask you the question of what should they have done? If you want to know the casualties of the Ukrainian military, of the Russian military, how is an American supposed to find those things out? There's only two ways he can. He can't ask the Russians, of course, they're not going to tell him. He has to ask the Ukrainians, or he has to go on the internet and look at websites where people look at open source information and make guesses. So if you look at these slides and say, well, these estimates are wrong, they're stupid, well, congratulations, you just figured out that military intelligence is a contradiction. It's very stupid. And that's just the way life is, buddy. Now, the last point I want to make here is, after all of this was said and done, is the leak significant? Yes, absolutely. Tucker Carlson ran a great segment on this, which I'll link in the video description as well. Essentially, there's three big important lessons from this. Some of the slides, which I covered in previous videos, talk about the number of American troops, including special forces, in Ukraine, on Ukrainian soil, and also talks about our ISR assets who are directly involved in the war. This is in direct contradiction to what Biden has claimed. He's always insisted, oh no, this isn't involving us, we're not a party in the war. That's a total lie, we are. The second main point is that despite all the massive support and even direct involvement of American assets and personnel, Ukraine is still losing, and losing very badly. I covered this at length in previous videos. Even if the casualty figures are not to be believed, the ammo counts are certainly true, because why wouldn't they be? And those paint a very bad picture of the state of the Ukrainian military. They essentially have no heavy support. It's just infantry and armored vehicles going into combat against Russian artillery and just soaking up casualties until they're combat ineffective. Now, the third and possibly most important point, not from the leak itself, but from how the leak was responded to, almost every corporate media outlet in our country is in the government's pockets. They only publish stories when given permission to do so, or just repeat stories given to them by the intelligence community or a government agency. I've seen multiple people point this out, including Tucker Carlson, who I mentioned previously, and Glenn Greenwald. No one in the mainstream media was interested in what the leak said. They only wanted to find out who was responsible for it and punish him. So, and really that last point, I think, should really spell out to everyone who still doubts the leak that a deliberate leak is unnecessary. The media is already in the government's pocket. Why would they need to invent a silly story when the media will just do what they tell them anyway? There's no point. There's just no purpose to deliberately leaking this. Thanks for listening, and please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check out the blog, Reading Junkie, in the description below.